a registered dietitian and the nutrition and wellness expert at Vivoo. I warmly welcome you to the Wired to Wellness podcast, the show for health and wellness enthusiasts to tune into science-based nutrition and lifestyle advice. You will tune into bi-weekly episodes featuring health practitioners, scientists, and entrepreneurs. Listening to our episodes and your body using Vivoo's at-home urine tests, you will learn how to improve your wellness, becoming the best version of yourself. Welcome to our first episode of Wired to Wellness. We have a controversial topic today: salt. Have you ever wondered if you are consuming too much salt? Salt is an essential mineral that many of us avoid, yet we may be actually doing more harm than good. In this episode, we will have your questions answered by the salt expert, Dr. James DiNicolantonio. Dr. James is the author of The Salt Fix, leading researcher and doctor of pharmacy who has reviewed over 500 publications. I know you're excited to learn more, so let's begin. Hi, Dr. James. This is Melissa. I'm the registered dietitian, nutritionist, and nutrition and wellness expert here at Vivoo. We've spoken before, but we're very excited to have you here today for our podcast. And today we would love to speak with you about your many, published research areas in salt and how we can relate that to, wellness routines and increasing sports performance. So thank you for coming today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You're welcome. So firstly, would you like to introduce yourself to any of our users who haven't met you before?
Sure. So this is Dr. James DiNicolantonio. I'm a doctor of pharmacy. I'm also a cardiovascular research scientist at St. Luke's Mid-America Heart Institute. And so through that affiliation, I've been publishing on basically nutrition, nutraceuticals, things like that for over a decade. So I have over 300 academic publications spanning the numerous health topics, but a lot of it does focus on cardiovascular health as well.
That's very impressive. Well, thank you again for being here today. So, over this past week, I've had the pleasure of reading your book, The Salt Fix. It's excellent. My friend, brought it for me. And, in your book, I was reading a lot about how we have been, told to avoid salt, but really adding salt can really help improve our performance. Can you, briefly touch on that topic before we go into salt and how and why our users should be careful about their salinity levels?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think kind of to level set, there's sort of a misconception that we consume a lot of salt compared to like historical intakes nowadays. And for example, animals that typically don't get a lot of salt in their diet, like let's say herbivores, they would go out and actually seek out salt. And so they would find the salt licks, and actually humans would follow those trails to get salt directly. So a lot of the original research from Eaton and even Laurent Cordain has sort of changed a little bit his take when these are paleo experts, that the intake was super, super low in salt. They weren't looking at salt that could have been extracted from salt licks, brackish water, salty interstitial fluids in blood from animal consumption. So they were just looking at basically muscle meat and land animal, not aquatic vegetation or aquatic consumption of foods as well, which is higher in salt as well. So the perception that humans evolved on a low salt diet is very contentious. Like no one really knows, but it's likely more than what most papers suggest because they don't take into all the potential sources that we would have actually gotten salt from. So the reason why it can help with performance is because humans traded losing salt and fluids to be a better cooling off machine. And so on one hand, it allowed us to, let's say, persist and hunt animals in the heat in Africa. But at the same time, it causes us to become depleted in salt very quickly. So when we lose our internal ocean, that dramatically reduces performance because basically effective circulating blood volume is controlled by salt and water intake. And when that goes basically down, performance goes down for numerous reasons, but mainly because what ends up happening when you're exercising is that blood is now flowing to working muscle, and it also has to flow to the skin to dissipate heat. So now you have competition for blood flow from the heart to the skeletal muscle to the skin. So if you can sort of prehydrate or at least maintain EU hydration during exercise, then the competition for blood is not going to be as big of a deal in regards to decreasing your performance.
So what would you say to our users who, we're all trying to increase our hydration, we're all trying to last longer in the gym? Is drinking water with just water itself enough, or would you recommend, certain athletes or certain users to actually add salt to their water or their meals?
So I sort of look at hydration through the lens of what exactly is the end user trying to gain from their performance. So the hydration strategy will be different if let's say if it's competition and you actually want to be a really high performer at that moment. Whereas it could be if you're just training to actually get better performance later on, then actually training to induce mild dehydration and becoming dehydrated acclimated actually leads to better performance gains later on. So if you're trying to boost performance acutely, then the literature is very clear that ingesting salt solutions, essentially salt is your blood, around 3,200 milligrams of sodium per liter, starting 90 minutes before performance. You slowly consume those solutions over about 30 minutes, can dramatically improve how long someone can vigorously exercise by up to 21 minutes, can decrease the rising core body temperature by about 0.75 degrees Fahrenheit, and can reduce heart rate by about 10 beats per minute. So it's one of the best things. It is probably the best thing that we've ever seen in regards to something that you can ingest to improve performance. It's about 10 to 20 times better than any type of pre-workout supplement like beta-alanine or beetroot juice, which can only basically boost endurance maybe 1 to 2 minutes. Salt solutions can do that 10 to 20 minutes. So it's 10 to 20 times more effective. But if you're someone who just wants to, train and feel okay, you don't need that much salt. Like you don't need 3,000 milligrams. You might only need 1,000 to feel okay with maybe 12 ounces of fluid. And then if you lose more than that during the training session, and you can calculate this because for every kilogram that is lost during training, which is a liter of fluid essentially, about 1,200 milligrams of sodium will be lost per liter of sweat. So if you've lost about a liter of fluid, which is again about a kilogram off your weight through sweat, then you would just want to make sure you replace about 1,200 milligrams of sodium to replace what's been lost.
So from what I'm understanding and what I read in your book was for those who are, working out at the gym every day for fitness or for just feeling better, weight loss, adding a little bit of salt to their diet will really make a dramatic, effect. But those who are actually in marathons or, and you had a lot of research literature in your book about that for, people, for professional athletes in competitive sports, it's, adding, as you mentioned, salt, the saltiness of your blood, the same in liquid form, has a very big effect. So why do you think we haven't heard this information yet? Why do you think that this is not, unfortunately, you mentioned beet juice. That's also a really good pre-workout, but we don't really ask for beet juice when we're at the gym, unless it's a really fancy gym and they freshly squeeze it for us. How come we don't hear about salt this much, do you think? This is maybe your personal opinion.
So I've actually never seen a review paper discussing preloading with salt and fluids. There might be one out there. So I had to actually look and find all the studies myself when I published my book. So I basically did my own comprehensive literature review on this subject. And the thing is there are a lot of studies actually showing that taking salt, like tablets, or even a solution during exercise may not work. And so you had to it's preloading. You have to get ahead of the problem. You have to boost blood volume prior to performance. And so a lot of people sort of kind of are against salt as not being that beneficial because they group all the studies together. But taking salt actually during competition, unless it's a very prolonged competition, isn't going to have nearly as much benefit versus preloading. So that's that's partly one of the reasons why. But the other reason why too is that just a lot of doctors fear salt and believe that it's like this poison rather than an essential mineral. But I truly believe most people don't just know the literature on salt and performance.
Yeah, that really may be. So from what I'm understanding, it might be that it's something in the future more and more the salt will get out. I hope that will also happen that way. What do you ever make recommendations to athletes, or if we have any viewers that are listening to us that are professional athletes, would you recommend them to try it once for, a day, before their workout? For instance, if they're a basketball player and they're training in the morning for 2-3 hours and in the evening, would you recommend them to add salt to their drink before and after, or just during their practice?
Yeah, so if someone's like feeling fatigued or lack of energy and they don't feel like they can actually probably have a really good workout, then, really adding about 1,000 milligrams of sodium and 12 ounces of fluid is going to help that person perform well. And it's not going to boost their blood volume so much where they're not getting any benefits from the dehydration acclimation that we talked about.
Yeah.
And then I do think athletes should definitely experiment with the rehydration strategy that I talked about, weighing themselves before and after, figuring out how much water they lost in sodium. But 100% they should experiment with the higher salt loading before competition, because you want to get the timing right. There's different things you can add to the salt solution to enhance its palatability and decrease its risk of diarrhea and things like that. So that is something that I have worked with many athletes on to tailor and get that appropriate for that individual.
That makes sense. Yeah. And so speaking about athletic performance and, maintaining your weight, what about salt and, I would say curbing your sweet tooth? Here on your cover, I love how it looks like a prescription medicine. And it says to use it on top of the salt. I'm just turning around. It says, use the salt to cut sugar cravings and improve health. I love sugar. I have a big sweet tooth. I'm not going to lie. What do you think some of our users would like to hear right now about salt and sweets? When I started adding more salt to my food these past 3-4 years, I noticed that it really decreased my sweet cravings. Can you explain, if you don't mind? It would be fantastic. A little bit more about the science, maybe about the osmosis, or how the cells are, getting hydrated and then not having dips in blood sugar after with salt, if you don't mind.
Sure. So there's sort of like 3 levels to this in regards to, number one, simply adding salt is going to curb the bitterness. So it's going to make foods taste sweeter. So you're not going to need as much sugar to actually make a food taste sweet. So that's kind of one benefit. The other benefit is that low salt diets, there's at least 23 human clinical studies showing that low salt diets worsen insulin resistance. In other words, they increase the levels of insulin after a glucose response. And that can actually precipitate more sugar cravings when you actually can't utilize your dietary sugar as well. So there's like a physiological induction of more of a reliance on carbs because you can't utilize them as much. So you need more and more to kind of get the same effect. And the third is in the brain, in the dopamine center of the brain. There has to be a mechanism, since salt is an essential mineral, for an animal to seek it out if they're deficient. Otherwise, they would not know to seek it out and they would die from salt deficiency. The mechanism is actually in the brain. It becomes hyperactivated and you get an intense reward from salt when the animal is deficient in it, which makes sense. But if you're deficient in salt, you also get an enhanced reward from sugar and actually other addictive substances. So this has been shown in numerous animal studies where they will deplete an animal of salt and other addictive substances, Adderall, other controlled substances, become much more addictive when they're actually deficient in salt because of that brain hyper-reward center connection.
All right. And what about some of our users who, getting back to a little bit, what you mentioned is really interesting, just about that dopamine. What about some of our users who are saying that they are adding salt to their diet, but their salinity levels are not changing when they're taking their Vivoo tests? What else could we say to that? They're saying that they're adding salts, they're also increasing their liquids, but they're not being hydrated. It's really hard to give a recommendation to an individual when we don't really know anything about their genetic makeup, their diet, their lifestyle. But could you maybe, elaborate on that for some users who are adding salt to their meal but not seeing a change in their salinity levels on their Vivoo test?
Yeah. So many factors can affect urinary sodium levels. So it's not 100% reflective in regards to intake. So what comes out in the urine in general is reflective, but there's so many things that can either cause the body to retain sodium, even if it's overloaded, like heart failure, like certain kidney conditions. And then there's factors that can cause enhanced salt excretion, like certain kidney damage in the tubulo-interstitial part of the kidney, or kidney nephritis, that can cause a lot of salt to be coming out in the urine, but you're actually super deficient. So it's not 100%, but if you take all that away, it is fairly reflective in someone who's generally healthy. That basically what's coming out in the urine is reflective of your dietary intake. But there are certain things that you have to look for to kind of like check off to say, okay, they don't have heart failure, they don't have, certain kidney diseases. We can kind of trust this. The biggest factor why, if someone's adding a bunch of salt, but they're still not seeing a lot in the urine, is because they exercise a lot. And so the reason why people who exercise are better at performance than someone who doesn't is because exercise induces salt retaining hormones and it expands baseline blood volume. So when you are someone who exercises a lot, you are a salt hoarder because your aldosterone levels are super high. And so you retain a lot of the salt that you consume. So if you're not seeing salt coming out in the urine in that aspect, your body still wants to hold on to it because it wants to expand blood volume, because you're constantly reducing blood volume through exercise, either by reducing it through dehydration, or literally you are exercising so hard enough that effective circulating blood flow to the kidney is going down. Like you're doing interval sprints, for example, that will activate salt retaining hormones. And so, it's sort of like it is a state of more salt need, even though you're increasing your salt intake. So for me, I've noticed I definitely have to usually consume about 3 scoops of an electrolyte solution per day for me to even kind of register my sodium in my urine, because I'm athletic and I consume a whole food diet, which is very low in salt because I'm not consuming the salty blood and interstitial fluids. So you just got to kind of take those factors into consideration.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, from what I'm understanding, you're saying that if someone is exercising a lot, their body is usually, holding on to salt. And as a result, they might not have very, normal or high salt levels in their blood. So that the hoarding of the salt, which you mentioned, would you say that individual should be worried about their salt levels when they're taking their Vivoo tests, or when they're, monitoring their salt, or they should, continue to monitor their well-being instead?
For a normal healthy person, becoming a salt hoarder through exercise has been shown to be completely fine. In fact, it's beneficial on numerous aspects. And because you're exercising, you're able to vasodilate much better. So even though you have a larger blood volume, your arteries are very good at dilating. And so your blood pressure actually doesn't go up. Typically with exercise, it goes down. So yeah, it's like a natural response to the stimulus, to the stress of exercise.
That's great. And, I always ask individuals if they're consuming a lot of coffee or, maybe tea or another type of caffeinated beverage. You're mentioning this in another video and also in your book, how coffee, America's favorite beverage, can also make you lose salt. Would you mind to just, explain that again for our readers here today? Because that's a very important point.
Yeah, it was something that I didn't even when I was writing the book, The Salt Fix, I didn't fully sort of recognize as much as I should have. And so later books talk more about the caffeine and the coffee effect of salt loss. But typically 2 cups of coffee will cause 600 milligrams of sodium lost, and 4 cups will cause a half a teaspoon of salt, or 1,200 milligrams of sodium lost, along with a certain amount of fluid as well with that. So if you are someone who drinks 4 cups of coffee or more per day, you're definitely at a higher risk of becoming dehydrated and when I say dehydrated, I mean not just water deficiency, but water and salt deficiency, a drop in blood volume as well. And there was actually a really good balance study that looked at this. It was they took a group of individuals, they consumed 3 cups of coffee twice a day, and they still consumed a full 2 liters of fluid, except part of that fluid was replaced with those 6 cups of coffee. They actually ended up being in a negative water balance of 700 mLs or 0.7 liters.
Wow. Wow.
So you have to really, if you're consuming fairly high amounts of coffee or caffeine, if you don't increase your water intake, it can actually induce dehydration.
Yeah. Yeah. And, for all our viewers, you can always measure your hydration levels using your Vivoo tests amongst many other parameters, which we're going to continue to talk about. But I also love just, I check always with my Vivoo test, and I also always check, my body. I'll see if my lips are dry, fatigue, headaches. A lot of the same symptoms of low salt can also be dehydration. So it's really important to drink your water, but also make sure that you're adding electrolytes to it, as you were mentioning, Dr. James, or salt to your food. Getting back to Vivoo, I'm going to ask you, what's your favorite parameter? But I feel like you might say salt. So what's your second favorite parameter for our tests?
Yeah, I'll go through some of my favorite parameters, but
Thank you.
I do obviously love the salt aspect, because even someone who loves salt myself, I register low a lot. If I'm not really, and so that really opened my eyes. Like,
wow.
I have to be very consistent in taking my electrolytes, because I don't eat processed foods, and so
yay.
Yeah. And you're right, you're gonna feel terrible by probably 2 o'clock in the day if you're not bumping your salt intake up enough, because a low salt intake is what leads to low blood volume and not a low water intake. You would have to actually lose 6 liters of pure water from your body for you to actually become symptomatic. You have to lose salt with that in order to drop blood volume. So typically, if you're symptomatic, like you're feeling lightheaded, you're feeling dizzy, that is not pure water loss dehydration. It's the other type of dehydration, salt and water loss. So yeah, I do love the sodium part of the Vivoo, and that's probably my favorite. But I do think it's important too, the water aspect, which is measured through urine-specific gravity, is very important, because not enough people drink enough water too. So even if you take a lot of salt, if you're not consuming a lot of water with it, you're not going to be adequately hydrated. So they're both very intertwined.
Yeah.
So I do like the urine-specific gravity part of the Vivoo test, but that should typically be done in the morning, or at least you don't want a significant amount of fluids consumed fairly recently before you do a urine-specific gravity. Like within 2 hours, if you consume a bunch of fluid, your urine might look dilute and hydrated, but you've just peed out a bunch of that, and your cells in your body actually isn't hydrated. So morning is really good for the urine-specific gravity. And then I love urinary pH too, is huge for me because I'm animal-based. So I have to be on top of either consuming my plant foods or consuming supplements to boost my alkalinity. Otherwise, my urinary pH will be low or acidic.
Wow, that's really interesting. Yeah, so you mentioned salinity, hydration, and also pH for your favorite Vivoo tests. And for me, I've noticed that the days that I am dehydrated, and I'll be shocked because sometimes I'll be drinking like at least 5 liters of water, but I do exercise a lot and having a lot of salt. I notice that I'm always low on salt and low on hydration, usually hand in hand, kind of like calcium and magnesium. When they're both higher, they're both low. And pH, we can talk about that too in a few minutes. But would you say that that's a common test result, that users are usually either high or low, or is it usually parallel with salinity and hydration for their Vivoo tests?
Yeah, it parallels well, because if you're not getting enough salt, you don't have the stimulus for thirst to drink the water, and so typically both will be low. And I see that in my results a lot too. And for some reason, humans just don't have that great of a thirst mechanism. Like when we exercise, we only typically consume 25 to 50% of the water that's been lost. Like our body just doesn't register that we've lost all this fluid and that we need to consume it all back. So and part of that is because especially if you're doing a whole food diet and you're not getting enough salt, you're not getting the thirst stimulus to drink water with it. And so adding salt to the diet will help to increase thirst, drive better fluid consumption, and improve hydration through that sort of thirst stimulus mechanism.
That makes sense. So it's essentially, from what I'm understanding, just to reiterate for our listeners, when we're not eating enough salt, our thirst mechanism isn't as sensitized. So, it does go hand in hand. I love watching food cultures and looking at ancient traditions. And I see that a lot of cultures from very hot climates, they have a lot of salty food in their diet, like pickled food items, salty fish, dried meats, spices. So it makes sense that we've been doing this for a very, very long time, watching our salt intake, as you mentioned in your book. Then let's go back to pH. I think a lot of our users are also really interested in pH. It's a very, very popular topic. So I think a lot of individuals, amongst myself, even though I've been trained, was really confused about pH because, someone says a lemon is acidic, right? It's sour, but then when we ingest it, its byproducts make our blood alkaline. So let's just, kind of explain that again to our listeners that, your acidic and your alkaline of your pH and your body load is essentially what's happening when you're ingesting food particles. And also it can happen independently, from metabolic waste or stress. But could you maybe go back and explain why pH is so important to you and why you want to make sure you have an alkaline environment or, a pH neutral environment in your body to support your wellness?
Yeah. So pH is important because humans are not pure carnivores. And so we cannot basically, let's say, ingest a high amount of animal foods without some type of acid retention at a certain point. Our kidneys just haven't evolved the mechanisms that carnivores have to fully be able to handle, let's say, a full carnivore diet effectively without some type of acid retention. Because the kidneys have a limited capacity to how much acid, which is called hydrogen ions, in the body. And so this is important because you typically don't see the pH in the blood get affected, but the cells and the interstitial fluid can become acidic decades prior to actually seeing it in the blood. Wow. And so there is other ways to look at this, and typically it's done through bicarbonate levels, even though those can actually remain fairly normal too for a while, even if you are sort of in what's called chronic latent metabolic acidosis, which is just essentially a term to say that you have some acid buildup in the body, essentially. Yeah. And so the confusion in regards to, okay, if I consume like something like a fruit that's acidic will make me alkaline, is because alkalinity in the body is through two mechanisms, either citrate or bicarbonate. And so fruits have citric acid, which by itself, citrate can bind the acid in our body, but also citrate can turn into bicarbonate. And so when you consume acidic foods, you are literally boosting the bicarbonate stores or the alkaline stores of the body. So that makes a little sense.
That does, and thank you. It can be very confusing for, our readers. So from what I'm understanding, you're very interested in pH. And are there any other, wellness routines that you would love to share with your readers? You've been talking a lot about how you, supplement your diet with electrolytes. You eat a whole food plant-based diet. I was reading your interview on our website, and it was talking about how you always make sure to eat, lots of greens and exercise throughout the day. Is there anything else that you think you do on a daily basis that, contributes to your overall well-being?
One parameter that I actually like to do if I'm using or testing a new supplement is to look at proteinuria using the Vivoo test strip. So I'll make sure that if I'm adding another supplement that it's not like damaging my kidneys and pushing protein out. One that I noticed, if you take really high dose B complex supplements, that started kind of throwing some protein in my urine. So it's There are certain B vitamins that don't seem to have any issue, like just if it's just very high dose vitamin B1 or B2, that doesn't seem to be an issue. But if you start taking higher doses of like B6, that might start throwing some protein in the urine. So that's a really another great way that I like to look at my kidney health is looking at the protein, if anything's coming out in the urine, if I start looking at supplement.
And that's really great because, a lot of individuals, sometimes they supplement with niacin to lower their CVD risk. And some of them do have, issues with their kidneys after. So it's good to test that with looking at the protein in the urine. I think that can also be a little confusing for our users. Just, the protein levels from our test, it's actually showing protein levels in the urine, which should not be present. We don't want to really work our kidneys too hard because, high protein levels has been correlated with some health damaging effects, for prolonged times. I really also have been interested in the magnesium because I was consuming magnesium supplements because it's marketed all the time. And, even though I pretty much don't consume most supplements, it's been so much marketed that I was taking magnesium powder in the night before I would sleep to relax my body, especially if I trained. And I noticed now that with my Vivoo tests, I don't really need to take magnesium. I have my magnesium levels are actually quite high. Have you ever taken, the Vivoo tests and noticed that some of your vitamin and minerals were actually optimal and you didn't need to take any supplements?
Yeah, I think I do recall that my magnesium was sort of like in the optimal range. And then when I started adding like magnesium supplements, it went quote unquote high. But also that can scare a lot of people, like if it's registering high. But yes, magnesium is extremely safe, except for people with like kidney disease, because your kidneys help regulate it. So there's been studies in people with high blood pressure that have taken up to 1,800 milligrams of magnesium per day.
Wow, that's a lot.
Many issues, and it helps lower blood pressure really well. So I'm sure their urinary magnesium would be really high. And I'm sort of starting to realize this a little bit more and more. A lot of people assume that having a high level of vitamins and minerals in the urine means that your body is just peeing it out and not using it. And there's no benefit to taking, let's say, supplemental doses. And that's just not true, because a lot of times the body needs high doses to actually activate enzymes. And then when the body's done with utilizing the nutrient, in order for it to be excreted in the urine, the body has to absorb it first, because urine is just filtered blood. So if something's coming out in your urine, that doesn't mean that you're having too much. For example, most of our water intake comes out in the urine every day.
That's a great example.
If someone says, I'm just paying for an expensive urine, well, I would kind of ask them and say, well, do you think it's not important to drink every day? Because most of that water is coming out in your urine. So your body utilizes these things, and then it will get rid of it. And it sort of likes to keep this sort of homeostatic level of intake where it utilizes it and then gets rid of it.
That makes sense. So from what I'm understanding, you're saying that even if we are registering as high or good, on our Vivoo test scores for magnesium or calcium, supplemental doses can be beneficial to activate enzymatic reactions in our cells, which might be really good if you're an athlete, for example, and your muscles need to recover, or if you're traveling a lot. Well, thank you. Is there anything else that Vivoo has helped you, in terms of boosting your wellness? Any other, thoughts or suggestions before we leave?
I think, vitamin C is a good one too. It makes me either take, a supplement or make sure that I'm eating vitamin C foods, which a lot of people aren't getting in their diet. So I think that's a great one, surrogate marker as well, that Vivoo tests for. Yeah,
and especially now that fall is coming and winter, flu season. So if you're going to the office or, if we have kids, it can make it something we need to take care of. Yeah. So, and, going back to your book, I would really recommend anyone to read this if they hadn't. It really changed my outlook. I've read a lot of health books and the amount of research that you quote, it's really, really amazing. And now that I understand that you did your own, you collected all this research on your own, that even makes it more impressive. So I'm going to read it again. I read each chapter, but I'm going to go back. I highlighted a lot of areas. Thank you so much for your time today. It was such a pleasure to have you. And we look forward to having you again. on our Wired to Wellness podcast. So thanks to all our listeners also for being here today, and thanks to Dr. James again. I'm looking forward to seeing you all next time. Thank you, Dr. James.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Wired to Wellness podcast, the show for health and wellness enthusiasts wanting to learn more about science-based nutrition and lifestyle advice. For more information about Vivoo, you can visit www.vivoo.io or email us at letstalk@vivoo.io. Don't forget to use the code WIRED30 at checkout to receive a 30% discount. Subscribe to our podcast and leave a rating and review. Follow us on our social media accounts at Vivoo app to connect with like-minded wellness enthusiasts. Take care and see you in our next episode.